And I think that is, we're ready. So again, I'd like to welcome you to this brief introduction to behavioral-based interviewing. And our goal, of course, is to help you hire the best. My name is Chris Kowalik, and I'm the president of the Rodan Consulting Group. And many of you on the call we already work with, which we are delighted. And with me is Ava Sloan, and Ava has been with me for over 10 years, I think. Is that right? Oh, you're muted, sweetie.
I got it. We are celebrating 11 years this month, Chris.
11 years. Boy, the time goes fast. So today, what we want to accomplish is we want to help you learn the format for an effective interview question. We're not going to go over everything about good interviewing practices. We'll touch on some, but mostly we're going to talk about the format of a really good interview question and why the format is so important and the subtleties of asking the questions in an appropriate way. And to formulate those questions, I'm going to encourage you to prepare ahead of time. These are not off-the-cuff questions. You want to think deeply about the questions. So we want to have also, we have an opportunity to ask follow-up questions. So we're going to dig deep into what that means there. Okay. Ultimately, what do we want to do? We need to get the right people on the right seats on the bus at the right time. The right people in your organization drive results. People that are not good fits can really disrupt your organization. Now, if you've done any hiring in the past, surely you or someone in your organization has probably made a mistake in hiring and hired someone that didn't meet your expectations. Don't feel bad. The data suggests that almost 2/3 of hiring decisions are maybe poor decisions. Poor decisions. How does that happen? Well, here's Ben. Ben was hired in March of last year. He submitted a great resume, had an impressive background. He was hired into sales. He had a resume that showed extensive sales experience. He interviewed really well, came across as a really positive team player. People thought he was perfect for the job. They thought he could hit the ground running and really do the job really, really well. You thought he was, you hired him in March and you waited to see this experience show up and him to really grab the job by the horns. But he seemed to, once he got on the job, he seemed to have a preference for working alone. He seemed to avoid gauging his team members, but you thought maybe this was just natural onboarding time. He needed some more time to get to know people. He also didn't seem to have a really strong sense of urgency, which you had hoped he would. And he wasn't as accurate or precise with the numerical information he had to process in the sales process. So within about 5 months, things were not improving. By July, you realized there probably is a problem. His energy faded. He obviously was not the hire you thought he was. And you found out the hard way that he really was not capable of doing the job that you thought he could do. So what happened here? Did he fool you? Did you miss something? Well, yes, 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 and yes. It's hard to find out all the things you know about a candidate in an interview. That's why the interviewing questions are so, so important. You could have known there is more opportunity to get more data from background checks and reference checks, more data from your interview, which we're going to focus on today, and more data from objective normative assessments about a candidate that can also feed in to your interview and feed into your interview of references. So how can we avoid bad hiring decisions? Again, today we're just focusing on structure of interview questions, not the entire process. And typically, our traditional ways of looking at candidates fall short. We get a resume in, and of course, the resume is important. It helps us screen in who to bring into the organization. But then we often do what I'll call an unstructured interview. And here, when we look at the data, more than 20% of the people will admit that they don't feel like they have enough, they don't have sufficient interviewing skills. And that's not surprising because we're really oftentimes won't go to training unless we have an HR function in interviewing skills. And oftentimes, if you are in HR, you're asking line managers and people that have jobs outside of HR to do interviewing. And their experience with interviewing is just basically how they've been interviewed in the past. So they base it on how they've been interviewed and what they think works. But what they think works may not work. And then finally, because we don't necessarily feel we have strong interview skills, we may default to using our gut feel about a person. Data suggests that 60% of the interviewers will rely on their gut feel about the candidate 15 minutes into the interview. Again, this is like getting married. Are you going to go on a first date, a blind date, and in 15 minutes decide to marry the person? But yet we do that often in the interviewing situation. So we want you to be able to upgrade your tools in your toolbox to be more successful. And what that means is we want to turn that unstructured interview into a structured interview using behavioral-based interviewing questions. That's where we're going to focus our time today. Then, how do we remove the gut feel and apply data? This is where the use of valid predictive assessments come into play in helping us even have a stronger, more unique interview for each candidate. We're going to touch on that today. Many of you are our clients and are familiar with the assessments. We'll touch on that a tiny bit today, but we're going to focus here on this. However, I'll remind you that the data from assessments provides you great interview questions and also provides a link to using structured behavioral-based interview questions when you're checking out the resume, meaning when you're checking out references. So your unstructured interview research consistently shows that conventional conversation interview provides only 14% chance that you're going to get the information you need to make a good decision. Okay. However, if you apply just the behavioral-based interview techniques, this can bring this percentage up to over 50%. Does it get to 75%? No, that's where the other data comes in, like data from assessments. But if you're going to do that conversational interview in an unstructured manner, what this data suggests is you would be better off flipping a coin. Heads, you hire the person, tails, you don't. There you bring your chances up to 50% of making a good decision. Why does this happen? Why are those unstructured interviews so poor in judging an individual, whether they would be good for your job? Well, one of the reasons is that we all have unconscious biases. And an unconscious bias does not mean a negative bias necessarily. Oftentimes it's a positive bias. For instance, we go in and meet a candidate. If I'm meeting Ava for the first time, she is just clearly a really nice person. She's going to give off the vibe that she's going to be a great person to work in my organization. I'm going to get positively predisposed to her immediately in the interview, and I'm going to overlook maybe the aspects of her experience or of how she's hardwired that may not fit my job well, but I like her, so I want to hire her. And we can tell you story after story, almost every week, we get our clients calling us up saying, oh, but they were so nice. Yeah, well, there are a lot of nice people in the world, but they don't necessarily fit your job. And that's your job in the interview to figure out if the person is going to fit your job, the culture of your organization and the team, as well as the boss. Okay, that is your job. So how are you going to do that? You are going to do that by using a structured approach in the interview. And the technique is called behavioral-based interviewing questions. And we're going to talk about those practices here. But first, I want you to do a little quick exercise. And on the handout page that I had sent, on the very first page, you have area to write these things down. But if you don't have it, just use paper and pencil. But I want you to write down an interview question that you find yourself using the most, or maybe one of your favorite interview questions. Put something down there. After you do that, then think about, why are you asking that particular question? What 3 things would you hope to learn from the candidate's answer? Okay, what would you hope to learn from the candidate's answer? So I'm going to give you about a minute to do that here, just because I want you to give some serious thought to what types of questions you've been asking when you've done interviews. Okay, and I'm going to put a little music on. If you don't like the music, you okay. Now I asked you to think about what you would want to learn from the candidate's answers, and that's the hallmark of what we want to learn from what we want to do in the interview, is we have to decide what we really need to know about the candidate before we hire them. We don't need to find out if they're a nice person necessarily. We need to know if they can do the job and if they're going to fit the team. So we really have to focus on what we need to learn about them, okay? I have a sales guy here, always be selling, always be closing. Sales folks are the hardest, in my opinion, are the hardest people to hire, because if they're even halfway decent, they should be able to sell you on them. And so it's really tricky to be able to interview a salesperson really, really well. It's not easy for other positions as well, but this can be some of the hardest. And we definitely have tools that can help you there. Now, I'm going to switch a little bit here and ask you, and you can raise your hand or put it in the chat. Have any of you ever encountered a bear like this close? Any of you? I don't see anybody raising their hand. I'm kind of glad in a way. I'm going to be going to Yellowstone in May, and they keep warning about the bears, so I'm a little afraid. I've seen bears from the car far away, but not this close. So if you did encounter a bear, there's also training on what to do in a bear encounter like this, right? For sometimes it's making yourself look big and not running, other times moving slowly, and then don't look the bear right in the eyes, that kind of thing, because that can be aggressive. So if I asked you what you would do if you encountered a bear, you would probably give me some reasonable ideas of what you would do. However, if you met a bear on a path like this gal, what you actually do may be quite different. You may freak out and freak out the bear, and that may be the end of you, which I hope that never happens. So let's contrast this to this. Most of us have done this on occasion, right? If we've been driving for more than 2 years, we've probably turned down a one-way street accidentally. That's a kind of a harrowing experience, maybe not as harrowing as meeting a bear, but it can stop our hearts pretty quick. You could probably tell me what happened, who was involved, why you think it happened, what did you learn from this? Ava, have you ever done this yourself?
Chris, thank you so much for asking me. Yes. In fact is just last week, I did it in Galveston. I've been going to Galveston a lot. You would think I would have learned which streets were going which way and which were going the rest, but there is, I looked it up, 64 one-way streets in Galveston. So I've done it more than once in the last couple of months. And it is very frightening because most people aren't paying attention to you and they would just run into you without even thinking about it. So yes, it's happened to me, and it's happened to me more than one time in the last couple of months in Galveston. So if you're going to Galveston, be aware, 64 one-way streets.
And why do you think that this might have happened to you? What do you think was going on?
Because where I live in Houston, not downtown Houston, because there's a lot of one-way streets in downtown Houston, but around the Clear Lake area where I live, there's no one-way street. So not paying attention to what I was doing. It was my fault. I wasn't paying attention.
Okay. Okay. And obviously you learned from that. Yes.
That pay more attention in Galveston to which way the streets are going, which way the traffic is going.
Which way the traffic? Great. Thank you for sharing that. And the reason I asked Ava to share that is that notice that she could tell us a detailed story about what happened in the past. She could recall a lot of details. If we spent more time and I asked her more questions, she would get very specific on what street it was, how fast she was going, how many cars were there, and then what happened next. And that's the analogy I want you to think about. The crux of behavior-based interviewing is you want to ask candidates about their past experiences. We don't want to ask candidates to predict their future behavior, like what would you do if you encountered a bear? Or what would you do if you encountered a irate client or customer? Don't ask them to predict the future, because really how we behave is indicated by what we've done in the past. So you want to ask them about past experiences. If you remember nothing else from this workshop, it's asking candidates, positioning your questions to ask them about their experiences in the past. Why is that so important? Well, for humans and most animals, our past behavior is a really good predictor of our future behavior. We are creatures of habit. Just like the deer here, they will cross the road at dusk and dawn and usually cross at the same place over and over again. We humans will do the same. If I had an anger management problem in my last job, I'm probably going to bring that same problem into your company too. So we want to ask people about past behavior. Also, future behavior, I can imagine all kinds of positive things that I might do. Again, I encounter a bear or an irate client. Yeah, I would believe that I might do this, this, and this, but what have I actually done? Okay, so that's where you want to focus on. So we're going to talk about the format here in a minute, but these are not behavioral-based interview questions. Tell me about yourself. If that was on page 1, if you mark that down on page 1 of your sheet, put a big cross over it. Tell me about yourself is not going to get you the detailed information that you need. You're going to learn something about the person, and that might be nice, but you might learn things you don't need to know. Okay, so it's a throwdown question that's not going to be real effective. What are your greatest strengths and weaknesses? Cross that out if that was on page 1. Please, please, please don't ask them that. Why? Because they have prepared to answer that. Any candidate that's even this decent will have prepared for that question. So they've prepared for it. They have a stock answer. It doesn't get to how they really are. Okay, Do you like to do something, or do you know how to do something? Now, there are certain situations where this may become important. Do they know how to operate a particular type of machinery? But there are also better ways to ask those questions. Also, you don't want to ask them questions that signal what the right answer is. So, candidate Ava, if I ask you, during busy season, we often work 50 to 60 hours a week. Is that okay with you?
Yes,
And
of course.
of course it is. I've just telegraphed the right answer. The candidate wants the job, the candidate's not stupid. But we all do this. I mean, I'll do that. And then I'm like, oh, I shouldn't have done that. So we do it. So we have to prepare our script in advance. So the point of the interview is to ask questions that elicit the things you need to know about the candidate. So what do you need to learn about the candidate? What we're going to drive this down specifically, but generally there are 3 things you need to know about the candidate. 1, will they fit the job? Are they going to be able to do the job that you have for them? And are they going to fit well for it? Are they going to fit the team? Are they going to work well with the team that they have to work with? Maybe the work is very collaborative work, but it might also be solo work, but all of us work within some kind of a teamwork structure. And then how are they going to fit the boss? Are they going to work well with a particular boss? That's important too. So then we have to get much more specific when we're thinking about a particular job and we're looking at candidates. Will they fit the job? We have to figure out what's needed in the job. I mean, that should be obvious, but I will tell you most of our clients and most organizations I see don't articulate what they need in the job very precisely. They'll say good people skills. Well, what does that mean? They'll have a lot of generic words here, but you want to drive this down to real specific things you need. Do they need negotiation skills? What kind of hard skills and technical skills do they need? We want you to articulate these on paper for yourself, because when you do, then you'll be able to formulate questions around what you're trying to find out. How are they going to fit the team? So what type of communication skills do they need? Do they need to be able to write really well? Do they need to be able to speak in front of large groups well? Do they have to have some type of management skills or some type of mentoring skills? Now you're going to say, oh, but that's on the resume. Yeah, hopefully these things are on the resume and these things as well. However, a resume is not an affidavit. A really good resume needs to be a marketing document. If your candidate is really sharp, their resume is going to look sharp. And candidates don't always have to put everything totally truthful down, okay? So it's your job it's not that they're deliberately lying, but they're going to pull out the good stuff, which they should. So it's your job to ask the right questions to drill down on those things on the resume. And then how are they going to fit the boss? Well, you got to think about who the boss is. Does the boss like to manage very closely, or is the boss generally not around and doesn't manage well? Different people work with different style of bosses. How accountable does the boss hold the person versus the person having to be accountable to the boss? These things you want to think about so that the best candidate's going to fit well in those 3 areas. So I want you to think about a position in your organization, and I want you to, this is page 2 of the handout. I want you to consider an open position in your organization, or maybe a position you just hired for, or a position that is frequently open in your organization. And on page 2, write down what that role is or the label for that, and then list some of the hard skills that are going to be needed for that job. And those hard skills, are going to be specific to the job. It may be that they have to be able to use Outlook, or they have to be able to use a certain type of project management software. But mark a few of those things down. And I have 2 columns on the worksheet. One is what's needed versus what's desired. That's another finer point if we talk about all the process of finding and hiring candidates. is separating what you absolutely need from what you want. And this page helps you to do that a little bit. And then in the second part, lower down on that form, list some competencies that you really need in that position and some that might be desired. Again, these might be, can they speak in public? Do they have management skills? Anything you can think of. Think about the person that did that job best in the past, and that'll give you some clues on what to put down here. Okay, does that make sense? If it doesn't, raise your hand, but I'm going to give you a minute or two here and turn on some music again so that you can really think about the position and that you're considering. And the reason I want you to do this is because I want you to come out of here with some interview questions that you've written yourself, likely that will fit for this job. So take a minute to do that. Okay, does anybody want to volunteer some of the competencies that they came up with? Anybody want to unmute and volunteer anything there? No? Okay, then let's press on and talk about how do we structure the interview questions to get at what you need to learn. What you need to learn are the things you wrote down on that sheet. So a structured behavioral interview question is based on what we call the STAR method. STAR for situation or task, action, results. So what this means is we want you to consider a situation or a task that's required by the job you have open, and we want you to ask the candidate about when they've been in that same situation or task. Like, have you ever driven down a one-way street? And then you want to know what happened. What happened when you drove down the one-way street? And how did it end up? And what did you learn? So you want to really focus on what is a common situation or task that your job requires, and then ask them about when they've encountered that same situation or task and what happened. So let's look at this and how that shapes up. So you may be interviewing for a customer service role, and in the STAR method, you want to think of a typical situation or task that they'll encounter. So one such situation might be that a client or customer gets unhappy or gets upset with a delayed shipment. So if that's something that might be common in your job, you'll know those common things, and you want to know how that candidate is going to perform, what they're going to do in that situation. You don't want to tell them what you expect them to do. You want to understand what they've done in the past. Okay. So that gives you insight into the candidate. You want to know how they handled upset customers, what actions did they take, and what were the results? What happened afterwards? So let's look at how we'd formulate that question using the STAR method. So a customer conflict. So the situation or task, how would we formulate that question? Well, one way would be, tell me about a past experience. Again, this is the leading thing. If you keep that in your notes right in front of you, tell me a past experience, that will prompt you to formulate the question pretty well. Tell me about a past experience you had with a customer who was upset or even irate with you because their order was delayed. Okay, so you set up a situation. You didn't tell them, hey, this happens all the time in our organization. We have these customers that are just miserable and they're always unhappy and we're always late shipping. We don't tell them that, but we want to know what they would do in that situation. So then we follow up. What actions did you take? Who else was involved? Okay. Now, these can be sequential. You don't want to necessarily overload the candidate with a paragraph of questions, but you can pause and then ask those questions. And then the results are usually handled in what we call follow-up questions. How satisfied was the customer? How satisfied were you with how you managed the situation? What did you learn from the situation? This is a pretty probing set of questions, and when you allow the candidate to really evolve their answer in front of you, you're going to hear a lot of good information about them. You're going to hear about a story about an irate customer. This is going to conjure up a story in their mind. You're going to hear about, understand how they manage that situation, and you're going to be able to judge if they have the temperament to manage those types of situations in your environment. And you're going to understand how much insight that they gain from this whole situation. So it's a very deep question, like all of these should be. You want to hear a story, you want to hear the next layer and the next layer. Okay, that's the format. Now, let's look at this a little more closely. So in this situation, what do we want to avoid? So we set up the question like this: past experience. So we're positioning it to ask them to tell us a story about what happened. The subtle difference is we're not going to say, have you ever had to deal with an upset customer? Because why is that? If you ask them, have you ever had to deal with an upset customer? They can say, no, they don't. They probably have, but they really don't want to answer that. So you've hit a dead end with the candidate. The subtle way is assume that they've had the experience. Just don't let them off the hook. Tell me about a past experience you had with a customer that was upset. By posing it this way, you have given permission to that candidate to tell you a negative story. And sometimes we do focus on negative stories because that's the more juicy stuff. You're going to learn more about the candidate and how their temperament is versus, oh, tell me about a wonderful celebration you did at work. That will tell you something, but these situations are going to give you more fruit. Okay. So the subtlety here is don't position the question as, have you ever had to deal with something, but assume that they have and just position the question that way. Okay. Now, in the actions, what actions did you take and who else was involved? Okay. We ask who else was involved because oftentimes candidates will, for good reason, want to assume credit for a whole situation. And we want to dig deep and find out, well, were they solely responsible for all of this or did they have help? And that's why who else is involved is an excellent, excellent follow-up question on many areas. So don't leave that one out oftentimes. However, we asked who was involved and what actions did you take rather than did you resolve the situation satisfactorily? Again, when you ask that question, of course, I'm going to say, yes, I resolved it wonderfully. Instead of letting them tell a story about what happened. We want to hear that story. That's the idea. And results, how satisfied was the customer? You don't want to say, was the customer satisfied? Again, that answer is going to be, of course they were satisfied. You want to know how satisfied the customer was. Why or why not? And the cardinal rule I don't want you to ever forget is skipping to ask the follow-up questions, allowing the candidate to answer something and then leave it lie. Always dig deeper. Always dig deeper. You're going to ask fewer questions, but deeper questions. So I'll have it on another slide, but a really great follow-up question is, well, tell me more. If you can't think of anything else, just say, tell me more. Or what else happened? Okay. That's if your mind goes blank. The other excellent follow-up question is a pregnant pause. Smile, nod, and don't say anything. Humans get real uncomfortable with silence. And your candidate will naturally start filling in the blanks, and they'll start talking, and they'll start telling you things maybe they shouldn't be telling you. And that's where you're going to get to the good stuff. Okay. So behavioral-based interviewing, what is it? It is asking questions about the candidate's past behavior. It's backward looking. We don't want them to imagine the future. These questions are open-ended. They're designed to elicit a story. They're hard for the candidate to game or prepare for. Now, good candidates do prepare for behavioral-based interviewing, and a really good candidate will use this structure to tell you stories if they're really well prepared, but they can't really prepare for the things exactly that you are going to want to find out about them. And what you're going to want to find out about them has to do with the job and the competencies that you need. They encourage the candidate to tell you true stories versus what they speculate might happen. Okay. And as I mentioned, the follow-up questions allow you to get into some juicy information. That's where really the really good stuff can be, is in the follow-up questions. Okay, so again, let's look at the structure. They have the 3 parts. You're asking them about a situation or a task, retrieving a past event. Tell me about a time when. What's the behavior that you're interested in? Where you had to solve a problem, and what were the results? So what are the outcomes? Simple format. Tell me about a time when you had to resolve a problem for a customer. How was it eventually resolved? Okay. We're going to look at a couple of these, and then we're going to have you practice a couple of these. So what are your best traits? No, that is not a good question. What are your best traits? If that was on your first page, one of your favorite questions, cross it out. You can do better. So what is better? Slightly better. Why do you think? Why do you think you would be good at this job? That's not a bad question. And if you use that, that's okay. But we can even get better. Ava, did you have a comment on that?
No, I just want to say that was one of my questions. I mean,
Cross-
that was my question. Why do you
Cross
think
it
you'd
off.
be good at this?
Cross it off. You can do better. You can do better. So what is better?
Okay.
What is better? What experiences have you had that you believe would make you valuable in this job? Why is that? Tell me more. Anything else are the follow-ups. Okay. What experiences have you had? So why is this so much better? Well, one, you're asking them to tell you about some of their experiences. You're not asking them to tell you what their best traits are. You want to know what experiences that are relevant to the job. What insights you're going to get here is how thoughtful they are. Also, how well do they know your company and the job? I mean, if they tell you about an experience that's totally unrelated to the job, you know they haven't done their homework or they're clueless about what your job is. And then you're digging into their thought processes. Why is that? Tell me more. Anything else? You want to dig and let them explore why they think they're going to be a good fit for your job. Much better question than what are your best traits? Now, if you disagree, please disagree here, but this will be more successful for you getting the information you need to know. Let's look at a question about teamwork skills. Are you a good team player? Oh my God, I can't stand that question. Ava, are you a good team player?
Yes, always.
Always in love. And please take that out of your ad, your job ad. We want good team players. Well, one, the people that aren't good team players are not going to read that and say, oh my gosh, I am not a good team player. I'm not going to apply for this job. You are wasting the characters in your job ad by putting that in there. Your job in the interview is to find out if they're a good team player. So you might ask them, tell me about what teamwork means to you. Now, that's an interesting question. It's not a bad question. Again, you're getting a little bit of a philosophical viewpoint from the candidate. Instead, I would suggest something more along the lines of, tell me about one of the best teams you've ever worked on. Whoa, that's kind of interesting, huh? What were some of the characteristics that made the team effective? Interesting there. Nice follow-up. So now you're learning about specifically their last organization, what kind of maybe teams that were cultivated in that organization. You're learning about why they think that that organization or why that team was so good for them. Much better than, are you a good team player? Yes, of course, I'm a good team player. And they may not be. Now, the follow-up questions on this can really, really give you more insights. So tell me about one of the best teams you were ever worked on. So they're going to tell you about it. Then you could ask them, what were some of the characteristics that made this team effective? So now you're understanding more about what they know about teamwork. So if they say, oh, we had fun together and we used to go to happy hour, that's a lot different answer than if they say, well, we really held each other accountable. Okay, much different answer. Now, are you going to get that answer if you ask them, are you good at teamwork? No. Another follow-up, what were your contributions on the team? So you're asking them to articulate very specifically what they did. What did you admire about the team leader? Again, you're starting to get insight on how they view leadership skills and what leadership skills they're tuned into. Again, the candidate that answers, oh, the leader was really a nice guy. He would always give us gift cards, once a month, versus the team leader really empowered us to take action. That's the things you're listening for. What did you learn about yourself being a part of the team? You're going to get some interesting answers there. And tell me how the team resolved conflicts. So now you're digging into what they understand about conflict resolution within a peer group. Okay. So that one question is really a series of really deep, interesting questions. And the follow-up questions don't have to follow that pattern. The follow-up questions are called follow-up questions because you're going to tee off of what they've told you. So you're going to tee off at what they told you to dig deeper into that story. Okay. So I'm not suggesting that those follow-up questions, you prattle them off as they are. You want to do a follow-up based on what they said. However, I would recommend preparing a set of follow-up questions as a guide, because when you're in the interview and you're actively listening, it's often hard to formulate those questions. Okay. So you can have these as throwdown questions, but as they answer, there may be other ideas that come into your mind. Okay. Now I want you to practice. I want you to do a little practice. And on page 3, you have a very specific format this specific format is outlined, and there's some room for you to take notes. So I want you to write down a behavioral-based interview question that helps you learn about the candidate and how they what their time management skills are like or their organizational skills are like. And you can kind of think about it in the context of the job you wrote down earlier. So write down a good formulated behavioral-based interview questions and perhaps 2 follow-on questions. And here I will ask for some volunteers to offer up their questions, but nobody has to. But take a minute to try to formulate a question like this around time management skills or organizational skills. So I'll give you a minute to do that and play a little music to keep us company while we do that. don't know if I gave you enough time, but would anybody like to volunteer their question? You can unmute yourself and volunteer. Everybody shy? Why is everybody shy? Ava, you were going to say something?
No, I just said, come on, come on.
Practice. This is a safe place to practice. Nobody's going to get, you're not going to get graded on this. It's a safe place to practice, and we do want to practice for sure. All right. Well, I'll give you some hints. I'll give you some potential answers. And this is these are real should be really specific to the job you have at hand. But this is a generic one. Tell me about how you plan and prioritize your goals and activities for the week. So now we didn't ask them if they did it. We asked them to tell me about their process. And if they didn't have a process, they're going to stammer a little bit. Some follow-up questions is, do you use a planner? Here's a follow-up question that this is kind of a follow-up, or can be a standalone question. Tell me about how you set your priorities for the week. This one I really like as one, again, it can be somewhat of a standalone question. We all have unplanned items that disrupt our schedule. Give me a recent example when your daily plan was upended. Okay, that happens to everybody. You're going to get an idea of how flustered they might get if there's a lot of interruptions, maybe in the job you have in mind. That job you have in mind and have open might have a lot of distractions. So you want to know how they're going to deal with that. How do you get it back on track? Who helped you? How do you prioritize with your manager? Another one that can be a follow-up to this one or standalone. In the past, give me an example where you just had too much on your plate. How did you manage through that, and how did that make you feel? Now notice again, in the structure of these, we're asking about past experience. Give me an example, give me a recent example, and also we set it up so that we assume the candidate has had that experience. When you just had too much on your plate. Well, everybody's had that experience. Now, they might say, oh, that's never happened. Most likely they'll pause and they're going to try to answer it. But if they ever come up with, well, that's never happened to me, whatever the question, don't let them off the hook. Just say, really, that's never happened, because that's really common. I'm surprised. And then pause. And chances are that's going to jog their memory and they're going to say, oh yeah, I remember. And if that doesn't, then say, well, tell me why you think that's never happened to you. And then let them expound on that. Don't let them weasel out of the question you want to ask. Okay. So that's a time management. Now, some things not to do. Again, we want to behavioral-based interview questions are not general. We've gone through that. Tell me about yourself. They're not speculative, meaning they're not future focused. How would you resolve something in the future? How would you resolve? If you find yourself saying, how would you do something? You're forward focused and not asking them about their backwards experience. You don't want it to be leading, as we said. We don't want you to telegraph the answer. Do you think you'll fit in our family-like environment? Is this a good fit for you? Well, yeah, I'm going to say yes, even if it's not. We don't want to use formulaic questions. Where do you see yourself in 5 years? Again, if that's on your questions sheet, I would gently suggest that's not going to be that useful of a question for you. Somewhat different question that gets at this is, tell me about your specific career goals around management, or about being in management. Get more specific relative to what job you have. And they're not theoretical. What's your ability to handle stress? And they're not goofball. Please, I would encourage you not to ask goofball questions like, how many angels can dance on the head of a pin? You'll find a lot of this on the internet of big companies that ask these goofball questions. Again, I don't find them, there's no reason to trick your candidate. You want to make them feel comfortable so they're honest and candid about who they are, so you can make a good decision. Unless you're hiring for a job in heaven, you don't need to know about how many angels can dance on the head of a pin. And most clearly, we're not going to get into today because it's too short, but there are a lot of things you cannot ask, and there are a lot of ways to ask questions that get at things, that get around the edges of things you can't ask. But by and large, the thing that will keep you safe is always focus the questions on what's needed for the job. You're not going to, you asking people about their hobbies and what they do on the weekend is not appropriate. Okay, even if they bring it up. And that is a subject for 10 or 15 more minutes in another session. So let's try this once again, and let's do another practice around writing a behavioral-based interview question around a candidate taking and having initiative and drive. Oftentimes we want to make sure candidates are really engaged and will take a lot of initiative. So how would we ask that question? How would we ask that question? I'm not gonna give you a time to answer that. I'm just gonna roll on. You can, for homework, please practice and write some of these questions yourself. There's space on page 4 of the handout where you can write some of these questions down and practice, and I will send you this slide deck so you can review it and make it your own, make your own questions. So around something like initiative, how might we ask that? Simple way is describe a project or an idea that was implemented because of your efforts. Okay, hopefully they've done something like that, especially if you need somebody to manage a new project. But the follow-up questions are important. What was your role? So if I'm a candidate and I said, well, I was a project lead or project manager on $100 million project, wow, that sounds impressive, right? But if you ask, what was your role? And how much of the budget were you accountable for? And how many people were your direct reports? You might find out that the person says, well, of the $100 million project, I was responsible for this phase, which had a $1 million budget, and I had no direct reports. That's a lot different answer than if they were the project manager over the whole project and responsible for a $100 million budget. What were the outcomes? In what tangible ways did you help the organization? Okay, you're asking them to really thread the needle there on what they did. Who else was involved? That was the one I was getting at. How did you and your organization celebrate success? What happened next? Tell me more. And my favorite is what I said. My favorite is to be silent, allow long pauses. Silence will get you a lot of interesting information. And, you know, this nice head nodding, nice warm smile, making them feel comfortable, they will start elaborating more on things you really need to know. Now let's hit up key practices here. We're going to review what we talked about, and you can take some notes on page 5 of your note-taking sheet. But the key practices is we want to first do our homework and up front really identify the job-related experiences, behaviors, knowledge, and skills that you need in that particular position. And the more detail you have here, the better able you are to evaluate candidates against that criteria. The better able you're going to be to formulate good interview questions around the things you need to learn. Then use the STAR method, as we talked about. We want to present them with a situation or task that's similar to what they're going to experience in our workplace. What actions and results are counted for that? The questions you want to make sure are always backward looking. Always, always, always backward looking. So here's some throwdown phrases you can jot down and remember to use. This will set you up to always ask those backward looking questions based on their experience. Give me a recent example in the past, from your past experience in a previous job. All your questions, almost all your questions will have that have that feature. Your objective, again, is to invite your candidates to tell you candid stories of what really happened to them, to encourage them to elaborate deeper on their actions, their feelings, their outcomes. So anything you can do to make the candidate feel comfortable about discussing uncomfortable situations is useful. And there's a few other questions that I'll show you that you can make an uncomfortable question more palatable for them. Allow your candidate to fully and completely tell their story. This means being quiet, nod knowingly. You can take some notes, but make frequent eye contact. Let them talk. Generally, in the interview, they should do 60% of the talking, and you should do, 66, 2/3 of the talking should be them, and 1/3 you. If it even gets close to 50%, you're not going to optimize the time you have and get their answers. Now, it is tricky sometimes. Candidates, when they start telling you a story and they get really engaged, may go off on a tangent that's not relevant to what you want to know about. In that case, you have to be prepared to sort of bring them back in, but don't shut down the discussion. And again, that takes a lot of practice. Again, these pregnant pauses and silences, I can't emphasize enough, are really helpful. And even if you can only ask 1 or 2 main questions, but you ask really good follow-up questions, you're going to learn a lot more than if you ask a million first level questions and skip the follow-up questions. Always have some follow-up questions noted along with your main questions. So let's avoid these mistakes. This is the last practice. Avoid these mistakes. Not preparing enough. Now, for a 1-hour interview, I know from the data, I know from our clients, I know from other organizations, most people walk into the interview, most interviewers may look at the resume 10 to 15 minutes before the interview, and that's the extent of their preparation. I will tell you that's not enough. A 1-hour interview, you will, if you prepare properly, it will take you 1 to 3 hours to prepare. Now, 3 hours seems like a lot, but remember, you're getting married to this person potentially. You need to spend time preparing. 3 hours would include doing a mock interview with somebody else in your organization potentially. 1 hour barely is enough to go through the resume, think deeply about the job requirement, and prepare your questions. You'll be tight in an hour to do that well. Are you going to take that much time? Up to you, but time spent here is going to be a lot of heartache avoided later by making a bad hire. Talking too much. Again, the rule, 2/3, 1/3, let them do the talking. If you're prepared, you are not going to have to talk too much. You're going to have your questions. You're going to know what to focus on. You won't have to do a lot. Now, one form of talking too much that happens a lot is, especially when we click in with a candidate and we really like them, is trying to sell the candidate on the company. And that's where we start talking too much, telling them how much we like the organization and how great it is and how wonderful this job is. I would invite you to hold that selling to the very end of the interview or a second interview. Your initial interview needs to focus on what you need to learn about the candidate to move them along in your interview process. Asking too many questions. Yes, I've given you tons of questions here. If you out of the questions we just reviewed today, there are too many for one interview on what we reviewed today. You want to slim it down to focus on the areas that are most important that you learn about that candidate. So if you need to learn if they have good management skills, you're going to focus your questions around management skills. You're going to go for fewer questions and deeper questions with deeper follow-ups. Again, do not ask questions that are unrelated to the job. How long will your commute be? That's a huge one, often in Houston or big metropolitan areas. You live far away, you're going to be able to commute. Well, you're not allowed to ask that question. Sorry. However, you can ask them Is there anything that will prevent you from reporting to work by 7:30, 5 days a week? Or anything preventing you from working the night shift, you know, 780 of 480 schedule or anything. You can ask those questions, but you can't ask them, how long is your commute? Where do you live? We often make assumptions. We look at resumes, we see things, and we start to tune into our own assumptions about things. Clarify those key points. If they say they worked on $100 million project, again, ask them, what portion of that budget were they responsible for? Don't let it fall down there at face value, because you miss the opportunity to clarify and learn something more. Be aware of your own biases. We all have them, unconscious biases. When you become aware of them, they become conscious biases. So that's a good thing. But if you generally, get predisposed to people that went to certain colleges and you think certain colleges have really great candidates, well, that may be objectively true, but you may be maybe too positively biased towards a candidate just because of a certain college they went to, for example. So pay attention to those things. Be aware. Let's look at another example of conflict. If we want to understand how the candidate approaches conflict, now that's a general area. If conflict is, you have to think about your particular job and if what area of conflict might be concerning to you, if it is. But here's a formula for a type of question around understanding how they approach conflict in the workplace. And this has a leading statement, and I'll explain that here in a minute. So for example, we might formulate the question as, it is very important to build good relationships at work, but sometimes it doesn't always turn out that way. Tell me about a time when you were not able to build a successful relationship with a difficult person. Okay. The main question is here, tell me about a time. However, this leading statement is to soften the question, to give them permission that it's okay to talk about something negative. And that warms them up to feeling safe that they can tell you the truth about this horrible experience they had with this horrible person at their last job. You want to hear about that story, so you want to make it safe for them to tell you that story. So similarly, giving them a leading permission. We have all had bosses that we did not particularly like or we did not get along with. Okay, so you're pretty much setting the stage to let them tell you about an experience they've had with such a boss. Now, here they might say, oh, I've only had wonderful bosses in the past. Really? Now here you have a choice. You can flip it and say, well, tell me about the best boss you ever had. What did you like about them? How did they manage you so that you felt like they were the best boss? What were some of their leadership characteristics? So you can flip that around too if you needed to. But we want to hear about how they've dealt with people they haven't gotten along with, because we're humans and there are people we're not going to get along with from time to time. Here's another one where we're asking them to tell us a negative story. When people are passionate about their work and ideas, conflicts with others can arise. Okay, so we've set the table for them that it's okay to talk about this. So tell me a time when you pushed one of your ideas too far and it created conflict with your peers. Okay, again, we're asking them to look in their past, and we are setting it up with the assumption that this has happened once before, or maybe more times before. And we softened it up to allow them to feel safe to do it. So these are all very, very subtle techniques. That's why we recommend preparing, because these are hard to formulate on the fly for most all of us, even the most experienced interviewers. Okay, real quickly, I want to hit on a couple of different style questions just so you peg where these fit. Closed-end questions are just that. Are you good at multitasking? I would tend to suggest to use those very rarely. They don't give you too much information. Verification questions are often important. When can you start work? What are your salary expectations? These are really, they're closed-end questions, of course, but they're just to verify facts. So you will need to use those. Most of your interview will be around these behavioral-based interview questions. There will be technical questions. The person doing the technical interview are going to have to evaluate the person's expertise in an area. So they may be asking a particular question that is evaluating the person's technical knowledge. Sometimes those are open-ended, sometimes they're closed-ended. Speculative questions, meaning questions that look to the future, I would rarely, if ever, try to use those. Other than what did you learn? What might you do next time? Those kinds of things, those kind of questions work. But having them imagine the future, like imagining the bear, is not going to be real useful. Skip the overused questions because your candidates prepare for them and they're not going to give you the detailed information that you want. Don't bother asking them about their opinions. One, you might stray into an area that is off limits and it's not useful. And again, traps and trick questions, I don't think are ever terribly useful for most of us. So avoid those. Now, you've asked these really great questions. So hopefully you're going to feel much more empowered, not to be trusting just your gut and intuition, but you'll have concrete information from the interview. Let's look about upgrading some of those other tools, but be aware that 2/3 of people doing interviews report that they rely on their instincts to make decisions rather than the data. And the problem with over-reliance on instincts is it often crowds out other more objective and valuable data. That's why we want you to prepare in advance those good interview questions that are linked to the things you need to learn about. Okay, now let's talk about some other ways to get the gut feel out of it. You've got that resume, which you're cross-checking in your interview. Now you have your structured behavior-based interview. And to avoid your gut feel, we want to apply some data. And that's where the assessments come in, applying data to giving you more objective information to make a decision, but also helping you formulate interview questions around that specific candidate. So again, we're trying to learn, will the candidate fit their job, fit the team, fit the boss? And most of you still here on the call are familiar with the Profile XT or the Profile Select, which is the upgraded version. And if you're not using the upgraded version yet, we need to get you on it because it's really useful. The PXT, of course, looks at people's thinking style, how they like to learn, can they process the information in the particular job, their behavioral traits, that's how they're going to like the flow of the work, the type of work, the style of work, and what they like to do, their interests. And we want to try to match them with using the PXT select data, match them to the culture, the job, and the boss. And how do we do that? How do we measure fit? Well, let's look at for the job itself. And how do we use information from this assessment during the interview and selection process? I'm not going to go deep into this. I'm going to just go through this because most of you are familiar with this tool, but I just want to highlight that the PXT Select gives you a selection report. It's designed to use ideally before you do the interview. We're looking at 20 different traits, 5 in the cognitive area, can they do the job, 9 in the behavioral traits, how will they do that job, and 6 in the interest, will they like the job? This lets us know if they're going to, how well they may fit the job. But how specifically does the tool do that? Well, we create what's called a job performance model. Several of you are familiar with this data, and this is a performance model. It shows the 20 traits in the thinking style, behavioral traits, and interests, and it colors in the areas where we believe, using data from your organization, where we believe the ideal candidate should land in those various areas. And then, of course, we match the candidate data to that job. And this assessment gives us some match percentages to the job, so we can get an overall match and see how well the candidate fits. But we can also really hone into where are they really far away from what we truly need. And that's where we want to focus the interview on, is areas where they're far away from what we need. So in the cognitive area, we want to know, can they do the job? Do they fit relatively good in the cognitive area? In the behavioral traits, how are they going to do the job? And of course, in the interests, will they like the job? Now, the nice thing about this particular report is that it is a selection report, so it is chock full of interview questions. And it provides you interview questions on every trait, but the ones you want to focus on is where the candidate is outside what your desired benchmark is. So this candidate is to the right of where we think the candidate needs to be for the job on this trait we call assertiveness. So it gives you some decent behavioral-based interview questions on assertiveness, and it cues you up on what you need to listen for. So it helps someone who's not experienced with behavioral-based interviewing, it helps them be prepared on why are they asking that question and what should I be listening for. So it's a really nice report when the people in your organization who don't have experience interviewing, it gives them a guide there. This also helps makes our interview more unique to each candidate, because the candidate that's outside the model on assertive, you're going to focus a question or two around that. The candidate that's outside the model on decisiveness, you will focus some questions there. So you're making your interview time a lot more productive with each candidate, making it unique. So that's the crux of measuring the job fit. Now, what about the team fit? How are they going to fit the team? Well, we use a similar methodology to measure the fit to the team. We are going to compare the candidate to a team culture model. So just like a model for the job, we can measure the team that the team that has the job opening. We can measure the people on that team and mush their data together, if you will, and come up with a culture model for that job. Now you'll say, I don't always want people that are going to be just the same as everybody else. That's right. This just tells you where the existing team is, and then you can make the objective decision. Do I want people that are just like the team, or do I want to intentionally hire people that are not like the team? That's pretty powerful information. So we create the team culture model, and then we place the individual on that model and see how they fit. Well, here, Mark, the team player, is much less assertive than the team. Maybe you want that. Maybe this team is way too assertive for the kind of work they do. And maybe you intentionally are going to be happy that Mark the candidate is not as assertive. Or by contrast, you may know that that team is effective because they all are modestly high on assertiveness, and that maybe Mark will struggle on that team. So this is the type of information that's going to really, really get granular on whether that person is going to fit the team as well as the job. Now, what about the boss? Same thing. We can get data on what's the boss like? What's the boss like? And then how well does the person fit the boss? Now, we're talking about a hiring situation. This particular report, manager-employee report, can be used with any manager-employee combination. But we also like to use it on candidates because it's important to know how that candidate and that boss is going to mesh. And so we can look specifically at the behavioral traits and where that candidate is similar or different to the boss. Again, they don't necessarily have to be aligned up, but this gives us insight. How are they going to work together? And we can probe deeper here and look, how will they work together? What's the boss like? What's the candidate like? And what are some things to consider? Okay, they have an outlook that is very different from one another. Is that going to be disruptive, or is that going to be okay with you? And then another area that we like to use with most candidates, if they have any potential to be in a leadership, management, mentoring position, is the leadership profile. This particular profile is generic for any type of leadership position. It does not depend on the particular job. What it's looking at are 6 key elements of leadership: creating vision, for example, inspiring people, mentoring, being approachable. So if you're hiring someone in and you expect them to do mentoring, you're going to want to focus on the mentoring section. And what that looks like, this one is for results, but it tells you the potential strengths of that person in that particular leadership area, some of the challenges, and it gives you interview questions that you can use right off the bat and tells you what to listen for. So very cool. So how do we put this all together? When you're making your selection, we want you to have good information about the candidate's past. We want you to have good information from the interview, and we want you to be able to predict their future behavior. So in the past, you're looking at their resume and their experience. In the present, this is their site visit, your interviews with them. And then future is getting information from normative assessments. The normative assessments will drive the questions that you ask from the references, and it will ideally drive the questions, help drive the questions you ask during an interview. If you gather a lot of data in all 3 areas, you're going to make a really good decision on the best candidates that wowed you in all 3 and landed in that sweet spot. I did mention assessments, and I want to mention a few more. The PXT is one of the go-to assessments for hiring as well as team building, but we have several other assessment tools that are very useful in the hiring situation. I'm not going to go through them now, but I want you to realize that we can really probe deep on your candidates in several different areas, including emotional intelligence. So good hiring practices, let's go through these quick and wrap it up. Good hiring practices with assessments is use the right assessment at the right time. Use it early in the assessment process so you can rank order your candidates. It helps to eliminate unconscious bias. It prevents you from wasting time interviewing candidates that are really poorly aligned. It allows you to be very unique in the interview, as we mentioned, depending on where the candidate falls. Use them consistently in that don't just cherry pick, well, we're going to assess this candidate, but not this candidate for this job. You have to treat candidates fairly. So be consistent across the board. I need to say this, but never mention any of the specifics about the assessment results to your candidates. Don't tell them. They'll ask sometimes, did I pass the test? The simple answer is, well, you've progressed in our interview process. You don't want to give them any information from the assessment. You want to use the information in the assessment to drive your interview questions. When you onboard them, then the PXT assessment results and some of the other assessments we use can be really good for onboarding tools. Prepare, prepare, prepare. Okay, this is whether you're using assessments or not, you need to prepare, prepare, prepare. With the assessment reports, there are tons of questions in them. The issue is you don't want to get overwhelmed by them and use them all. You want to prepare and cull down just to a very few important ones that work for you. Just because they're all there doesn't mean you need to use them all. And you want to choreograph your interview questions with other interviewers so that the candidate doesn't experience the same interview with two interviewers from your company. One person might be doing an interview around interpersonal skills and leadership, and somebody else might be doing a technical interview. But choreograph that real carefully. Again, that takes preparation, and that takes everybody writing down their questions in advance, which would allow you to do some mock interviews. So I am going to wrap it up. We went through a lot here. And if you're ready to learn more, if this wet your whistle a little bit, we do interview skills training at a more intermediate and advanced level. So we have that available. We can do that on site or by Zoom. We have programs to help you use assessments more optimally during the interview. And we we do consulting programs on helping you improve and optimize your hiring selection process. And any of you on the call today, if you do book out any type of workshop with us, if you do it by the end of this month, if you make a commitment that you want to do a workshop and we conduct it before the end of month June, we'll give you a little discount because you came today. So we want to thank you for that as well. And with that, what can you expect next? You will get this slide deck. You'll get a list of behavioral-based interview questions. You'll get a little cheat sheet of interview questions, as well as a little playbook that walks you through this that you can share with your colleagues at work. Again, we offer much more extensive training here. Let me know. You can unmute. Let me know what you think today. If a word or phrase, you can type in the chat box. If about what you learned today on a scale of 1 to 10, did it meet your expectations? And are you willing to do something about this after the fact? And in what I'm going to send you is a little commitment to action sheet that I'll send you after this to prompt you to use some of this information. So give me some feedback. You can unmute if you like, and ask or some questions you might have, something that popped up that you thought.
Hey, how are you?
Yeah, hi, Kat.
How's it going? I don't know what's going on with my camera. I tried to turn it on, but
That's
it's not
okay.
going.
That's okay. Did you have a question? You have something that?
No, I was gonna say you reminded me of the importance of just always being open-ended. I find myself leading sometimes. I'm no, don't do that. So I always like saying, walk me through a time that you did blah 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 instead of did you do this or did you do that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you
That
for
was a good
that.
reminder.
Thank you for that. It is easy to do. That trap that you fell into is so easy to do. Trust me, I know, I do. It's why having a script can really help. Can have a script. Yeah. Good.
This was super helpful. Thank you. You know, you do it every day, but it's always good to go back to the basics and the fundamentals.
Excellent. Glad that was helpful. Yeah, it is, because we're not, we don't do it every day. So that's why the collateral material I'm going to send you, that you can use that to help prompt you before you have to do an interview and whatnot. And again, we'll be posting this video too that you can share. Feel free in your organization to, gather some people around and watch the video together and discuss how you're going to interview next time, because everybody can use a little bit of a refresher course, a little bit of a refresher there. So with that, if there are no other questions, I would like to, again, thank you all for your attention. I enjoyed being here today, and we hope to see you again at another workshop at some point.